All right. Well, it's great to see you all chatting with each other already. But we're going to get started because we have a really packed day. So hi, everyone, and welcome. We're absolutely delighted to see so many of you joining us today to learn and reflect on the challenges and solutions to scaling effective parenting support in the UK. So the election of a new government interested in breaking down the barriers to opportunity creates an exciting and important moment to think about how we can enable families to access evidence-based support and what we need to do to make this vision a reality. And as will be clear today, this thinking and this doing need to be done in collaboration across a number of different actors. And we're delighted to see so much enthusiasm from various parts of the sector in participating in today's event and in this discussion. So today's event is co-hosted by Nesta and Foundations, the What Works Center for Children and Families, two organizations for which parenting support, evidence, and scale are absolutely core to their missions. And it's been an absolute delight to organize this event with Foundations. I will hand over to Donna Molloy, Deputy Chief Executive of Foundations, to say a few introductory words shortly. So for any of you who aren't familiar with Nesta, let me just start by saying a few words to introduce us and our team, and Donna will do the same with Foundations in a few minutes. So Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good. For over 20 years, we have worked to support, encourage, and inspire innovation in service of society. Since 2020, Nesta has focused on 3 missions, one of which is a Fairer Start mission, which I have the honor of leading. And in the Fairer Start mission, our goal is to eliminate the gap in early childhood development outcomes between children from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers. And we really bring a wide range of capabilities to achieving this goal, from program and intervention design to research and evaluation, data science and evidence generation, and policy work. And our strategy recognizes the critical importance of the home environment and parenting in the earliest years of a child's life and much beyond. And one of our key objectives is to ensure that all parents who need support do get it. So today's event really aims to build our understanding of the barriers preventing effective support to scale and reach the parents who need it most, and to develop our thinking about the solutions that are needed. There is now plenty of evidence showing that evidence-based parenting support can be one of the most effective strategies that we have for improving children's outcomes in the early years. Our co-host Foundations have played a really important role in compiling the evidence for parenting interventions in their guidebook to make it more widely available to the sector. But despite the hard work of for so many years, currently, still not enough families are able to access family support in their children's earliest years. The landscape for parenting support, or the market for parenting support, is very fragmented, and both the nature and the quality that parents are able to access very much depends on where they live. We also know that parenting program developers face challenges in developing and scaling their interventions. And we also know that local service providers face challenges in staffing and implementing their programs. So there is really a multifaceted challenge here, which requires lots of collaborations across a range of stakeholders. And that includes program developers, program implementers, researchers, funders, local and central government, and obviously children and families, in order to ensure that their experiences and outcomes are at the heart of what we do. And we really much hope that today will be the start of a conversation that would lead to further collaboration and partnership. So as I was saying, today we've got quite a packed and really exciting agenda. So let me tell you a little bit more about how the day is going to run. So in the morning, we're going to focus on understanding the challenge and where we are at now. We're going to have a series of presentations and followed by a roundtable discussion to draw out our participants' perspectives. Then in the afternoon, which will be chaired by Donna, we're going to turn our focus to building solutions and what national and local infrastructure is needed to support the use of evidence in this space. And again, we'll have a couple of presentations and table discussions. We're going to finish at 4 with refreshments and an opportunity for further networking so you can continue to build connections and discussions, hopefully inspired by today. So following the event, we just wanted to let you know that we'll share the recordings of the presentations and the slides, and we'll write up the discussion sessions. So throughout the day, we've created a range of opportunities for people to feed in their views about what they're hearing, what they're thinking. And this includes the 2 table discussions that I've just mentioned, as well as some live polls that will run via the website Slido. And we're going to do one right now to get you warmed up. So if I can just ask you to take your phones out. And you can either scan the QR codes, or if it doesn't work, just go to the Slido website, so slido.com. And then you'll be asked to enter a code, which is 3645173. Hopefully you're there. Yeah, we do have Wi-Fi. I think it was where's it's outside, the password is outside, but we're going to bring it here. And so you'll see there are 2 questions. Which sector are you from? And what are the 2 challenges involved in scaling parenting interventions that you'd most like to tackle? So please, share your thoughts with us on these questions. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. Okay, so I see most of you have probably finished typing. So thanks a lot for that. We'll have another one later in the day. So now I'm going to hand over to Donna for our first presentation. Just want to say before I introduce Donna more fully that so we're going to have a series of presentations. We're not going to have a Q&A after each presentation, but there will be an opportunity to discuss your questions with the presenters either during the table discussions or break before that. So Donna Molloy is Deputy Chief Executive of Foundations. As I said, she leads Foundations' work on impact and ensuring evidence is used to influence local and national policy and practice. And Donna is going to speak to us about why we need a national focus on effective parenting support.
Thank you, Sarah. I hadn't planned to introduce Foundations, but following Sarah's comments, I will just very briefly. I hope most of you have heard of Foundations. We are the What Works Centre for Children and Families, born out of the merger of the Early Intervention Foundation and What Works for Children's Social Care, which happened almost 2 years ago. Now it feels like a lifetime ago, actually. But we are very focused on understanding what works to support those family relationships we know are crucial to children's outcomes, and also other positive relationships for children who can't live with their families for whatever reason. So I'm really pleased to be here today because parenting is such a huge part of the focus in terms of the work of Foundations, but also because I feel like I've spent a lot of my career now making the case for parenting support and trying to persuade both governments and leaders locally about the importance of this. And so it's just really exciting to have a whole day dedicated to this today, and to have so many familiar faces in the room. So I've been asked to talk about why we need a national focus on evidence-based parenting support, the role of central government, and how I'd like to see national policy develop. My opening point, as Sarah said, is that the main reason we need a national focus on parenting support is because this is one of the most well-evidenced routes to improving things that many of us care about in relation to children's important child outcomes. It's difficult to overstate the importance of the role that parents play in their children's lives. Parenting is one of the most significant influencers on children's development in the early years. Obviously, early education and children's own characteristics matter, but, and I don't need to tell this room this, the quality of the parent-child relationship is crucial. We know that whilst most parents do an excellent job at supporting their children's needs, some parents struggle. The reasons for this are well known. Parental mental health problems or conflict between parents can reduce parents' capacity to engage positively with their children. And we also know that financial pressures can create stress and conflict that can spill over into relationships with children, and in some cases make it almost impossible for parents to meet their children's needs. And so for many reasons, inequalities in children's development open up early, resulting in gaps between the most disadvantaged children and their better off peers that become increasingly large and difficult to shift as children develop. Yet we know that effective parenting and family support can make a significant and positive difference in reducing these gaps. And so for a government focused on improving opportunity and prevention, it really feels like we should be talking about this more at the moment. This is the key way in which we'll reduce income-related learning gaps in children's development. As Kirsten will talk about later, Family Nurse Partnership has some of the best evidence in the UK about how to help disadvantaged children achieve a good level of development at the end of reception and Key Stage 1. We know that supporting parenting is central to preventing mental health problems in children and young people. Again, I don't need to tell this audience these problems are on the rise, and we know that lack of sensitive parenting and use of harsh discipline is linked to behavioural problems, which are the most common mental health problems in early childhood, affecting about 5 to 10% of young children. Again, supporting parenting is part of the solution here. Parenting offers a means to intercept behaviour problems early before they become established. We know that without support, parents can inadvertently reinforce negative behaviours, making them more entrenched, which can lead to school failure, the likelihood of antisocial behaviour and more severe mental health issues and so on. And there is very good evidence that group-based parenting interventions can prevent some of these problems becoming established. None of this is new, and I'm sure many of you have all heard this many times before, but it does feel at times we are in danger of forgetting what we know here. There's lots of focus on the roles of school and childcare right now as part of the Opportunity Mission. And obviously what happens in schools and childcare settings is crucial, but we'd argue these settings can't do the heavy lifting in terms of outcomes on their own. Parenting support feels like a key way by which we would achieve what the new Secretary of State, Bridget Phillipson, has described as her objective of levelling the playing field. And as policymakers are considering how to make a reality of the new government's commitment to prevention, we need to make sure that we recognise the contribution that effective, carefully targeted parenting support can play. I think we'd go as far as arguing parenting support is prevention in action. The second point I'd make as to why we need a national focus on effective parenting support is this is an area where we do know a huge amount about what works, and we should be using this evidence more consistently. Many of the effective interventions here aren't new. We've known what works in some important areas of parenting support for a long time now and don't need to reinvent wheels here. Yet despite all of this evidence, we're not very effective at bringing effective programmes and practices to large numbers and a diversity of people. There is a long-standing and stubborn gap between what the evidence tells us is effective and what is often available for children and families locally for a whole range of reasons. One example, intensive home visiting for vulnerable parents, the best known version of which is Family Nurse Partnership, which I've already mentioned. At its height, FNP operated in about 80 local authorities, reaching 13,000 new parents. It's now offered in less than a third of local authorities. Another example, and Kirsten will talk about some of this more later, the Incredible Years parenting intervention, of which there have been several trials in England, each finding a positive impact on children's behaviour, yet less than 25% of children and young people who need this type of support currently receive it. We must ask ourselves, we know that research and evidence have transformed healthcare. Whilst obviously social interventions are far more complex, we must ask ourselves why we aren't thinking about effectiveness in terms of support for vulnerable children and families in the same way. And it does feel that reducing this gap between the evidence and what's available is crucial, given we know that outcomes for children in some of the most deprived areas are worsening. And again, this is why the conversations that we'll have today feel so important. So I was asked to offer some thoughts as to why central government has a crucial role to play in terms of scaling effective parenting support. I'd say government's role potentially falls across a number of crucial activities. The first is setting the vision and ambition. It feels like only government can do this and drive this throughout policy across departments and via the relevant delivery chains. Other countries have really put their shoulders behind driving up use of proven interventions, and we could argue that in this country we are lagging behind somewhat. As Kirsten will talk about later, we've got experience in the UK of trying to scale up effective interventions in this space. The last Labour government made huge progress on implementing a number of effective interventions, but we've lost ground over the last decade or so. Secondly, government has a key role to play in supporting intervention development and ensuring that promising models are evaluated for impact, so we have the evidence about what works that we need. It's probably blindingly obvious, but it's worth reminding ourselves that having a range of proven interventions which have been evaluated and shown to improve outcomes is not something that's likely to happen by accident. We need to be purposeful about this. And whilst, of course, this isn't just about government, and there's a huge range of other organisations that play a crucial role here, research funders, providers, organisations focused on innovation and capacity building, and so on, I would argue it does need focused, purposeful, central coordination to make sure this happens. One of the reasons we have a relatively good evidence base for parenting interventions in the UK is because of the investment in high quality evaluations that happened because of the focus on this area in the 80s and 90s, which really stands in stark contrast to some of the other areas in which we work at Foundations. For example, children affected by domestic abuse, where we have not had anything like the same focus and have a dearth of high quality UK studies. But we can't rest on our laurels and need to keep the evidence base current, which means continuing to evaluate as support models evolve and newer models emerge. And it feels like government involvement is crucial to stimulate the development and evaluation of interventions where there are gaps, so that we have a sufficient range of interventions able to meet child and family needs. One area, for example, where we know far too little and which we are very focused on at Foundations at the moment is how best to support parenting in a child protection context. It's also important to keep pushing the boundaries of what we know. For example, moving the evidence beyond specific single interventions. We get criticised a lot because of our focus on single interventions, which are obviously only part of the solution in terms of improving outcomes. And it feels we really need to deepen our understanding of system-level approaches or test the potential of implementing the common elements of effective interventions when they are incorporated as part of day-to-day practice. And there's huge interest in this area at the moment and feels like a really crucial priority in terms of exploring and evaluating the potential here. Government also has a crucial role in terms of creating the incentives and conditions for scale-up to happen. This involves supporting the providers of effective interventions, and it's good to see so many providers here today, so that they can deliver at scale and the interventions that they offer be made available more widely. Obviously, this doesn't have to be government alone that does this, and obviously others such as Nesta, Big Lottery and a range of other organisations are in this space. But someone needs to have a sort of central coordination function, I would argue, to make sure that it happens. There's a huge amount government can do in terms of creating the incentives via ring-fence funding and other mechanisms to encourage the availability of effective interventions locally. Many examples where we've done this in the last sort of 20 years. One example I was involved in, the DFE Parenting Early Intervention Programme, where over 2007 to 2011, we increased the availability of well-evidenced models of parenting support across all 152 local authorities. And I know many people would argue that mandating specific models on its own doesn't work, but I think you can recognise that it's important to create buy-in for programme models, alongside arguing that some of the strongest models of parenting support should be available and shouldn't be optional, and that we owe children and families access to some of the strongest and most proven models. Government also has a role, I would argue, in supporting local commissioning and ensuring that proven models are implemented well. It's really important that all local authorities are provided with clear, reliable information about which interventions have been shown to be effective for different outcomes. Evidence can be complicated, hard to interpret, and we need to make this easy for busy colleagues at local level, which is where organisations like Foundations come in. And I'll just digress for a second to plug our own work and just let people know that we'll be launching our new toolkit for the new merged organisation, which brings together the previous Early Intervention Foundation guidebook and the evidence store from What Works for Children's Social Care early next year, which we hope will help with some of this in terms of making that information easy to access. But of course, knowing what works is in some ways the easy bit, and as organisations like the Centre for Evidence and Implementation frequently emphasise, making it happen is often where things go wrong. And we know lots of things can get in the way in terms of delivering evidenced interventions locally. Scaling up well needs resource, time, capacity, buy-in, and a whole range of things which are often in short supply. And government has a crucial role here in creating the conditions for success. If we grip this, it feels that there's a real opportunity to build understanding about how we do this in a way that would really move us forward. So just to finish, how would I like to see national policy develop? Well, firstly, a new focus on parenting in national policy. The mission and focus of the new government provides an opportunity to give serious attention to scaling up some of the effective models. This needs a concerted push from the centre. Implementing proven programmes should be a new national policy priority. There's lots of examples from other countries where proven programmes have been implemented at scale, and we have seen improvements in population level outcomes as a result. Why is it that we can't do this here? This needs a clear central narrative about supporting parenting being a crucial area for state-supported intervention. This isn't about the nanny state or telling parents what to do, but about giving them the help that we know many parents want and need. And it's about being clear that this is a way of reducing income-related disadvantage gaps. It should be clear about the case for evidence-based parenting support and make the case for this at local level. And there's a key role for DFE in all of this, in ensuring this national vision is shared across departments, with the work of the Department for Health and Social Care and Home Office pulling in the same direction, with cross-government recognition that supporting parenting is a key part of prevention in relation to mental health, crime, antisocial behaviour and adverse childhood experience. There's potential to bring together a single vehicle across government for how we do this, and think about locally how we align commissioning and funding from local authorities, integrated care boards, the National Health Service and criminal justice and policing. Secondly, policy needs to use the relevant levers to full effect in order to drive use of proven approaches. Obviously, funding here feels like an absolutely necessary condition for change. That's not a message that people want to hear right now, given the fiscal situation, but it feels like there's no point really shying away from it. Any new vision must respond to the current context of increased complexity and overstretched services. There is scope to consolidate funding into a new simplified funding stream with clear conditions, and we might want to consider a requirement that new programmes offered through family hubs, the Children's Social Care Pathfinders, Youth Futures hubs and so on, are evidence-based and selected from a set of proven interventions. And also important to ensure some of the wider system levers, such as inspection, are also reinforcing use of some of the strongest models. Thirdly, I also think as part of this, we need to think about transporting interventions. Some of the strongest models are not available currently in the UK, and we would recommend government considering a small number brought here on a pilot basis, and we could set up a new evidence importer type function to bring key interventions to the UK with central support and mandate, as happened with Family Nurse Partnership under the last Labour government. And very finally, implementation support to help local authorities commission programmes which are appropriate to the needs of children and families and to make sure they deliver them well. We know this is crucial. It can be very difficult to carefully match interventions to the specific needs of children and families locally, and time and attention is required to develop strategies which engage the most disadvantaged or minoritised families and ensure that work to scale up effective interventions doesn't inadvertently entrench existing inequalities, which I know Leandra will talk about later today. So to finish, I'd argue there's real opportunity right now for the new government to grip this. There's lots of lessons from the last 20 years about how to do it and how not to, which I'm sure we'll get into throughout the course of the day. A recent Institute for Government report said recently, history is not destiny. This was in relation to prevention in public services, and I think it applies here too. We have the knowledge and expertise that we need to do this. The government's commitment to a mission-driven approach which promotes decision-making for the long term provides the perfect opportunity to embed a suite of effective interventions as part of an evidence-based local offer for children and families. So let's not be having the same conversation 5 or 10 years from now. Let's use today to seize the opportunity to put effective parenting support centre stage, using the collective energy, expertise and influence that we have in this room. Thank you.
For such a clear and powerful set of thoughts and recommendations. So we're going to move on to our next presentation by Louise Bazalgette. So Louise is Deputy Director of a Fair Start Missions at Nesta. She's leading our work on parenting, and she's particularly focused on how we can scale effective parenting support to more families in the early years. So Louise is going to speak about recent research that we carried out with the Behavioural Insights team to explore what it takes to reach scale. There you go, Louise.
Great. Thank you. I think my mic's working, which is great. So, as Sarah mentioned at the start of today, Nesta's A Fairer Start mission has a very challenging goal. We call it a moonshot goal, which is to eliminate the gap in early childhood development outcomes between disadvantaged children and their peers. And the nature of this goal means we have to be very ambitious in our thinking. So we think that to achieve our mission goal, we will need a step change in the number of families nationally who receive effective parenting support during their children's earliest years. And we think of this very much as a shared goal, one that can only be achieved in collaboration with many different actors working together. And in pursuit of this goal, there are some key questions that we're exploring here at Nesta. which we think we need better answers to. For example, how can we get a better fit between family need and the amount and types of support available nationally? What innovation or evidence gaps do we still need to fill so we can offer the right support to each family in a cost-effective way? How can we make effective parenting support much more widely available through integrated local services? And finally, but perhaps most importantly, how can we destigmatise accessing parenting support and improve parent engagement so that the support that's provided is being accessed and is useful to parents? But these are not the only questions we need better answers to, and we want the help of everyone in this room to help define the challenges that still need to be addressed. So it's another Slido moment. So please could you now open Slido again on your phone or laptop, either using the website or the QR code, and please add your thoughts here to our question, which is, if we want to substantially increase parents' access to effective parenting support in the UK, what do we need to better understand as a sector? Great, and we will include your thoughts in our write-up, so it's all going to be gathered and will be brilliant input for our thinking going forward. So at Nesta, we think it will take the whole early years sector working together to ensure that families get the support they need in their children's earliest years. In our work, we're trying to be really outward-facing and help to bring people and organisations together around this common goal. To inform our programme of work in this area, we recently undertook a project to learn from previous work on scaling parenting interventions in the UK. And we wanted to learn, what does it take to successfully develop, test, and then scale a parenting intervention in the UK? And particularly, what are the barriers to doing this successfully? And also, what are the enablers? And we worked on this project with our colleagues at the Behavioural Insights team, who've done a lot of work in this space. And we wanted to consolidate what's been written about in the literature, as well as speak to a range of experts working in the field. The report was published in July this year, and as well as a lit review, it also involved interviews with 23 experts, including people working in policy and those who research, fund, develop, and implement parenting programmes. And we also included 4 case studies showing how 4 different parenting programmes reach scale. So if you haven't read it yet, it's an interesting read and you can see what that journey looks like. So thank you so much to everyone who supported this work. I know many of the people in the room here today were involved. And in the rest of my presentation, I'll just briefly summarise what we learned in this project, which was quite wide-ranging. So firstly, the report identifies an enabling context as the first factor that's needed to scale parenting interventions effectively. A lot of interviewees emphasised, in line with what we've heard from Donna this morning, we need central government strategy and national initiatives to support scale-up, and they need to be based on a really solid understanding of what makes for effective implementation. Secondly, the funding for local implementation needs to be sufficient and be sustained over a timescale that makes it possible to both initiate and sustain delivery. Lots of interviewees emphasised to us that stop-start funding causes huge issues for recruitment and retention of staff, and also for local awareness of which services are available to families. Interviewees also emphasised that commissioners of services need to understand the importance of robust implementation, so programmes are delivered with fidelity. However, it's also healthy if there's dialogue with programme developers so that implementers can advocate for adaptation and tailoring where that's needed to fit their context and the parents that they work with. An enabling context also included the importance of effective local partnerships to enable joined-up delivery on the ground. And we heard from those who develop interventions also But the process of developing a program that's ready for scale is a really long haul, and I know that will resonate with many of you. So the developers need enough funding and support so they can successfully overcome the many hurdles that are involved in designing and iterating an intervention, testing it and evaluating it. So it gets to that point of being an evidence-based intervention ready for scale. And I thought this was a pretty pertinent quote from one of the intervention developers that was interviewed for this project. When you have a project, you can find money to evaluate it to death, but forget about money to develop and scale it, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of those challenges. A second key theme in the report was around the importance of the resource team. And this is made up of centralised expertise from the intervention developers and also expertise on the ground to implement parenting support really effectively. Firstly, facilitators, because they're so important. They have a crucial role in recruiting and supporting parents to engage with parenting programmes. And to enable facilitators to succeed, they need the right funding and contracts, the right skills and expertise, and also demographic backgrounds that will support them to engage with local parents. And we also learned from interviewees that the central resource team works best when there's a supportive dialogue between the intervention developers and those who are implementing it, and help setting up good arrangements for training, supervision and accreditation is an important part of that. So this quote from the evaluation of the National Academy of Parenting Practitioners emphasises that good quality training is just the starting point for scaling up evidence-based parenting interventions effectively. Once trained, practitioners will continue to require support from their agencies, particularly in terms of time, resources and supervision. And that came up a lot in the report, that shouldn't be underestimated. And then the report also really emphasises that it's absolutely crucial to give enough thought to the needs of parents and caregivers. And some aspects of this include planning really effective recruitment with an emphasis on destigmatising parenting support, joined up local services to help identify the parents who can most benefit, making sure the support meets parents' access needs, including timings, locations of when and where it's delivered, and making sure the application and onboarding process is really straightforward for parents. And I thought this was a particularly illuminating comment from one of the interviewees in the report. They said, I find that often the facilitator and parent are the last two elements in a scaling strategy. People decide the number of locations to scale in, the model to use, and the stakeholders to engage. But then facilitators and parents are the afterthought rather than recognising them as the intervention's focal point. And the fourth area highlighted in the report is around the need to really think about scale throughout the process of developing a parenting intervention. And some of the enabling features for this identified in the report include needing guidance that supports delivery with fidelity, really high quality implementation, and having arrangements for monitoring and evaluation in place, and supporting implementers with issues like parent recruitment. And we also learned that implementers have a preference for programs that provide options for tailoring and adaptation to meet the needs of specific groups of parents, as that makes it work better. It's also helpful if there are delivery options that can provide flexibility to accommodate parents' access needs. And then again, they really emphasised that if there's honest and open communication between implementers and programme developers, that facilitates good problem solving and just makes everything work better. So this is a quote from the report itself. Interviews with central government policy leaders and regional government programme implementers highlighted the utility of modular interventions that can be endorsed by national institutions, but they simultaneously leave a multitude of important decisions to local actors, thereby enabling both central direction and local ownership. And I think that's bound to be something that's going to come up a lot today, is getting that balance right. And then the final area highlighted in the report is the importance of having a fully considered scaling strategy in each place where a parenting intervention is implemented. And I won't have time to go through all the elements of this. You can find it in our report. But the template framework shown on this slide, and thank you to the Behavioural Insights team, including Patrick Taylor, who's been very much involved in developing this. It shows a tool that's included in the report which could be used by implementation leads in a local area who are planning how to implement a parenting intervention, and also by anyone seeking to scale a parenting intervention at a national level, and talks through all the different elements that you might need to consider in that. So now this was an interesting one. We didn't ask interviewees for specific recommendations on how to tackle barriers to scale, but they came through with so many great ideas, we wanted to include them in our report. So these are some of the kind of spontaneous recommendations that were made about how Nesta and others in the sector could make a difference. So these recommendations are kind of aimed at the whole sector. So firstly, interviewees emphasised that we need to ensure parenting support is consistently a policy priority in the UK, so that funding for implementation is sustained over time, and that one was really emphasised again and again. We need to help commissioners and implementers by identifying a short list of the most effective parenting interventions. Otherwise, it's just such a big task wading through the evidence to decide what to implement. People also talked a lot about the need to destigmatise accessing parenting support. Example given of perhaps a public communications campaign, so that many more parents will feel willing to engage. And also needing better access to research and development funding that's tailored to implementers' needs to help overcome multiple barriers in developing a programme that's ready for scale and that has robust evidence behind it. And then we also had a recommendation that we should create a public health business case for parenting support that clearly demonstrates the societal gains from investment, which Donna was talking about this morning. And this fifth recommendation is also an enabler for the recommendation to ensure that parenting support remains a policy priority, so that being really important to make that case. So I'll just end on our key takeaways. At Nesta, we found this to be a really useful piece of research, so thanks to our colleagues at the Behavioural Insights team who we worked with on this. And our key takeaways from the work, which have very much informed the plans for today's event, as you'll see, are firstly, a huge amount of knowledge is already held in this early years sector about barriers and enablers to scaling effective parenting support, so it's really important that what we do next is really grounded in that knowledge. And to make progress on this agenda, we need more collaboration between policymakers, researchers, funders, intervention developers, and those who commission and implement parenting programmes to tackle barriers and strengthen enabling systems, both nationally and locally. And we very much hope that today will facilitate that. And we think that through better collaboration, with a focus on substantially increasing the scale of parenting support on offer to families, we could accelerate progress on improving outcomes for disadvantaged children in the early years. So I really look forward to working with everyone here today on these shared challenges and opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Such a great summary of the report, but it's a really rich read, and I very much invite you to download it from our website and give it a good read. So we're going to continue digging into this understanding of the barriers to effective parenting support at scale. I'm going to invite Crispin Day to give his presentation. So Crispin is the head of the Centre for Parent and Child Support at the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust in London, and also head of the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services Research Unit at King's College London. Crispin's work focuses on the development, implementation, and dissemination of evidence-based interventions to help give children the best start in life. And Crispin, you're going to talk to us about the supply-side barriers and enablers from the perspective of a provider of a parenting intervention. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for inviting me to talk with you today and share some thoughts. When I got the brief, I thought, should I use this as a marketing exercise in a kind of subtle way, feeding in some lines about the work that my wonderful colleagues do, or should I try and talk honestly about the experience of I've spent probably a quarter of a century developing programs with amazing colleagues, some of whom are in this room and will be talking later. And I decided that's the kind of strategy that I should adopt here, is not blathering a kind of subtle marketing spiel, but to talk openly about the process of developing programs and some of the things that I've failed to do over the last 25 years. As many of you will know, I should say probably just as a bit of a background, the particular connection I have with Nesta is that they funded some years ago a dissemination program for one of the parenting programs that I was involved in developing called Empowering Parents, Empowering Communities. And that program's now available in a lot of local authorities areas in the UK and also available in partnerships in Australia and South America and Europe and East Asia, particularly China and Japan. Everything that I've thought about the UK is kind of really interestingly the lens of working in other countries is a fantastic way of seeing our own context and culture and so on and so forth, and things we do well as well as the way in which other people address some of the challenges that we face. Right, so having said that, so this is a kind of typical linear way in which program developers make evidence-based parenting interventions. We dream something up, that is, we develop a program and the theory of change, and we write a manual to ensure it's kind of standardized, and then we plead for money to conduct pilot trials and feasibility trials, and then kind of full RCTs. And that sort of that journey takes 3 to 5 years to complete. And in the process of writing the funding applications, there will be a section that says dissemination. And what the right way to fill that in is to say, we will produce X number of journal papers that will be published in really excellent, high-profile research journals. We'll run some seminars, and if we're lucky and we're nice to Donna and other people in this room, we might get an opportunity to run a seminar with policymakers of one sort or another. What there isn't in that process is when we've completed this and discovered, amazingly, this time it worked as opposed to every other time when it didn't, we will drop it, our intervention, into this system whereby it will then be uptake and it'll be available in people's front rooms through a well-honed, easy process. That does not exist. But what that process does mean is that developers can then flash up slides like this that show, oh, here's some evidence that this works, and there's an effect size, and so on and so forth, and you can see the publications. What that doesn't do, and I think this is a kind of challenge to the kind of evidential side of things, is there are some genuine challenges and problems with the type of quantitative, predominantly quantitative methodologies that we use within research. It's pretty slow, as I've just illustrated, 3 to 5 year turnaround for one program. I was involved in a systematic review that looked at parenting programs for non-Northern European, North American or Australian populations, either within our host countries or elsewhere in the world. And the vast majority of the globe's population, we have no evidence whatsoever whether parenting programs work or not. And we have extremely limited evidence for programs that work for Black, minoritized, and socially disadvantaged populations in their communities, because those are generally not the populations that the research focuses on. We have a less understanding, because all research is based on averages. Compare two groups on a mean basis. Is this group different after the intervention from that group. What it doesn't show is the people who don't benefit. It gives you an average benefit, not an individual benefit. And the pharmaceutical industry, not that I'm here to advertise them, but they do pretty much better on into the characteristics of people who are likely not to benefit from an intervention, the numbers needed to treat to get an effect, and so on and so forth. And I think there's room for an honest conversation about those sort of things. And of course, there's a real struggle with knowing the best ways of trying to get these interventions out of the test tubes into real life. And as the speakers so far have talked about that process of kind of trying to build an evidence base around implementation. So when it comes to dissemination, it's very easy to get into a sort of exhortation persuasion mode that says, you really need, EPEC is the program that I'm often associated with. You really need this in your local area because it's evidence-based, it's tried and tested, it's 4 times cheaper. You see me getting the subtle marketing in here, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm really not, over the 25 years that I've been doing this sort of thing, actually I've moved away from the you should really listen to me to a position of talking to service providers, commissioners, people with money. And my question has to be, and I think our question is, what keeps you awake at night? And if we understand that, we can then start to think about how some of the stuff that me and my colleagues produce, which is really quite good sometimes, we can then figure out the relationship between what we have and how we might be able to help people sleep at night. If we get to that process of somebody wanting or seeing the fit between what's keeping them awake at night, the challenges within their local communities, and what we have to offer. The next question is about adoption. And adoption conversations, not for bad reasons, but for pragmatic reasons, really appear to focus very much on train and hope. That we'll be asked to train folk in the hope that somebody somewhere does something with what they've been trained under the kind of extreme service circumstances in which they operate. And kind of once the decision is taken, it feels like it's then somebody else's responsibility. The alternative is something that I think is the flavour of today's conversation, which is actually how collectively do we as a system go about developing planned, supported, organisational implementation of things that work. And Louise's report, very nicely, you've got a shout out there for your diagram, very nice diagram that really evokes, this is Tricia Greenhouse's model of implementation, which you'll be very familiar with, which essentially says people like me in the maroon need not just sit in a dark corner making programs, but we need to be able to communicate and engage people and understand organisational change. And working with you as commissioners and senior providers and policymakers is a complex thing, because you've got to hit, as the parents and practitioners in the quote said, you have to hit every level of an organisation. And to turn that into some complicated diagrams, here's a complicated diagram, which you enjoyed, because this is what it entails. And I have loads of these complicated diagrams. There's another complicated diagram. Not surprised, this is real data from 15 sites funded by Nesta, who are all individually delivering EPEC. Hundreds of parents through this, and this shows how each site got on with their outcomes from that graph that I showed earlier. In the treatment trial, you get the effect, take it out into the real world, and you start getting kind of bumpy unevenness. It's not equal. And site 1 and site 15, there was very little effect at all. And that's because implementation is a complex process. And each of those factors that I flashed up on the screen with loads of boxes, each of those things is weighing differently across each of the sites, because implementation is affected by many different things. They're complex systems, they're non-linear, and they change all the time. So we'll have kind of providers who come to us really, really keen. They're brilliant at filling the forms in. Life changes. Whereas others, we kind of go, I don't think these folks are going to make it. But actually, we'll go with it. What we've learned over time is just a spirit of of wanting to work with people, because things come right. The different... these things have to line up in some sort of way, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And over time, each of those different levels is moving around, and you'll hit a sweet spot where they all line up. And the entire thing goes green. Here's a kind of 2 minutes ago. Here's a little discursive thing and a shout out to parents. This is not from EPEC. This is from a different program that we were working on. And we were making some new kind of practitioner-parent tools. And we asked the practitioners and the parents, oh, what do you think of this? Because we wanted to get some feedback from everybody. And what I love about this graph is the red lines are essentially how impressed the practitioners were with this new set of tools. And the blue lines are how impressed the parents were. And you can see this is what's a bimodal distribution amongst the practitioners. It's Marmite. They either really didn't like it or they loved it. The parents, on the other hand, generally liked it, and liked it quite a lot. But you then go, for the practitioners at the far end of the graph, what is the chance that a parent will receive something that they really like? Okay, last thing, because I need to shut up. I hope I'm giving the impression that this isn't about a linear delivery of parenting programs. This is about a genuine collaboration between parents and populations in a local place, the service context in that place, and how any parenting program can connect and work with the service to meet the needs of the population. And you can see, I assume these slides will be available once we've got the day. So on these slides, I've just mentioned some kind of key aspects of each of those three components, which I won't go through in detail now. And I was asked to say a few things to finish about what might make a difference. And I think there is something that's really important about when I fill in a research application form and it comes to the dissemination bit, that there is something out there that I can say, and I will feed this in to this system of delivery. Because otherwise, I just work in isolation, and every other program developer works in isolation. And we're nice to each other if we're lucky. But if there was a system out there that encouraged delivery through a dissemination system, that would be perfect for us. And I also think, just as a subtext, that we in this country should be proud of what we make ourselves. and that we don't necessarily have to go to import from other places, that we have got amazing things that we can build and develop ourselves. The other thing is we have to make implementation easy. We've really got... I've made loads of programs that have been incredibly complicated, and when we've tested them with parents, they've just gone, no, could you make it a few less sessions? Could you make it easier for me to use this? Parenting interventions are complex interventions, but we have to make them as simple to use as possible. And it is about having evidence, evidence-based evidence, as it were, but we also need to be able to show that it's demonstrably useful to the people at the front end who are going to be expected to use these. That's where the evidence is as important, so that a practitioner can see that it works for them and parents like it. That's really crucial, not me doing this kind of exhortation stuff. And the last thing is that, along with Donna and Louise, I think that we have to have a concerted effort, because organisational change, my experience is, if you can get 3 years of it, that is amazing, because things will change. So it requires an amazing alignment, persistent alignment, to get 3 years worth of change, because that gets us to that gets us to decent delivery level. And we've got to carry on collecting evidence. That's the last point. There's no point just going, well, it worked in a test tube, so it's bound to work in Southwark. I say that because that's where we work. Right, okay, I better finish there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Crispin. That was so interesting, and definitely not enough time to really get into all of it. So we're going to take a quick break now. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to invite you to, if you'd like, get a cup of coffee or tea outside and then come back to the room, so that we'll move on to the next presentation. Maybe if you can be back in like 5-7 minutes, that would be really great. Thank you. Really lovely to see all those conversations. Great, so thanks for coming back. So we're gonna have like one more presentation, and then you're gonna do a lot of the talking in the roundtable discussion. So our next speaker is Joanne Stewart. Joanne is the head of service for early help and support at Blackpool Council. She's led and managed children's centres from implementation to being fully operational in Blackburn with Darwin, and more recently has led the planning, development and implementation of family hubs across Blackpool. So Joanne is now going to speak to us about demand-side barriers and enablers from the perspective of a commissioner of parenting support.
So as explained, I'm the head of service for early help and support in Blackpool Council. I've had the privilege to work in Blackpool for just short of 4 years now, but I've spent 34 years working in the early years and early help arena. It's a long time now. I don't know how that's happened, I really don't. So most recently in Blackpool, as again said, working on family hubs amongst a range of other things. Blackpool is a better start area, so it's benefited in the last 10 years for long-term sustained funding that's given us some real opportunities to lay some groundworks for a whole range of programmes and support for our youngest children and their families. And we are one of the 75 local authorities that receive family hub funding as well. It's through the work of A Better Start that we had some really firm foundations for our Family Hub offer. Lots of things already in place through a research, test and learn kind of approach to implementation. Working alongside families to understand what was right for them and doing some co-production work, and a real eye to what would be sustainable in the long term. So when I arrived in Blackpool, and when we started to look at our family hubs, we already had a lot of the Start for Life offer, bare bones in place. So things like our parent-infant relationship service, our early years speech and language offer, breastfeeding support, and some of our elements of our parenting offer. So we were able to use our Start for Life money to really enhance what we already had and develop an offer where we had gaps. The work in Blackpool has been achieved through really strong partnership working between the council and A Better Start, which is NSPCC led in Blackpool, utilising each other's skill, expertise and influence to develop an offer and taking a joint leadership approach. So this is our current offer in Blackpool. I'm hoping I name drop everybody in the room really, really well. If I've not, it's not that we don't love you. It's just that I've got. So in 2021, as part of Blackpool's improvement journey, we launched a new early help strategy. Key actions in that strategy, amongst a number of, were about delivering and improving, developing a group-based parenting offer for our families in Blackpool, start to build a stronger early help system. And alongside that was our commitment to developing our parent relationship offer, seeing parenting and the relationship between parents as independent pieces of work. So a nod to Gordon Harold's work with the EIF and the impact of conflict on parenting. So we now have a whole suite of programmes that create an offer pre-birth up to 19, up to 25 for children of families with SEND, a group, an individual offer, virtual offer. Never thought I'd be saying that, but virtual group parenting programmes on offer. And we've been able to do that by utilising Start for Life money, Better Start funding, partner budgets and hard needs block funding from our SEND service. Parenting support has been a key part of the work of Better Start, identifying evidence-based programmes and adopting a test and learn approach to implementing them in Blackpool. And that's how we've ended up with things like Safe Care, Survivor Mums, this is where I name drop everybody, For Baby's Sake, Video Interactive Guidance or VIG, Baby Steps and EPEC, of course, Kristen. We then sought to build a wider offer of group-based parenting programmes because a lot of those programmes are individual family-led. Again, that worked across the whole age range, with the vast majority of that delivery, those group-based parenting programmes, coming to be part of my team's delivery, so part of the early help service and part of what family workers do. But we also have programmes delivered by our parent-infant relationship service known as PAIRS in Blackpool, young carers, health trainers, so it is a partnership approach to some delivery. We did have family nurse partnership in Blackpool, but commissioned alongside our health visiting service, but it didn't quite fit for the demographic for Blackpool, and there were families that were missing out on that level of support because of their age. So we had to take the difficult decision to change how that worked. So running alongside all of this suite of programmes now, we have an improved reducing parental conflict offer. So awareness raising, workshops for staff so they feel confident to ask the questions, programmes for individual families and a group-based offer, and of course online delivery for those that want to self-serve. So we've heard already a lot about implementation. So I'm going to talk more around our experience most recently of implementing Triple P, I think that's the last name drop. As part of our Family Hub work. So this is where we were able to really capitalise on the knowledge and research skills that our Better Start colleagues had and possessed. And I would say that's one of been the real benefits of working in Blackpool, has been that Better Start offer, that capacity that researchers bring, that knowledge, those skills that I perhaps don't have or don't have the time to do, and neither do my team. And that's really, really helped us. So that, coupled with our expertise in implementing programmes, scaling up, permissions, because we line manage a team that we can direct the work, has really come together to support us in developing our offer. So as part of the Family Hub work, I seconded a member of the Better Start team to come and work as part of my management team to lead our Start for Life offer. So I had a Vicky. Vicky provided the capacity to look at the evidence base of programmes, review the core messages and the content of programmes. She worked with our wider partners to make sure that we understood their offers and the alignment of messaging, and really supported us in making our decisions around what would work for us. Vicky then worked alongside Susie in developing and implementing our plan. Susie leads the formal early help team in my service. Our plan was to train our existing team members to deliver groups. Susie led on the identification of those staff, operationalising the plan and developing a parenting coordinator role. Because on the face of it, our programme looks very busy. There's lots going on. So how do you make a decision about what's right for this family? What would right in these circumstances? So to manage that, we have a parenting coordinator, Lisa. A key member of staff who understands the programmes and their messages, can advise parents and practitioners about the right programme. Lisa's been absolutely key in championing parenting. She loves it and it rubs off on others. So she's now leading our parenting team. She makes a difference. We also have a process called Family Hub Triage, a multi-agency group of leaders that come together on a regular basis to review requests for support. So that includes the early help service, social care colleagues, our early parenthood service, as was FMP, for baby's sake, midwifery, health visiting, and our parent-infant relationship team. They meet, they share information, talk about families and make a decision about what's the right programme for them so that we can navigate that complicated system on practitioner and family's behalf. But it's given us a really sound sense of leadership, joint leadership around parenting in Blackpool. We don't as yet have a parenting strategy, but it is something that was in our thinking. So I was asked to think about some of the key questions that for commissioners might be thinking about. So value for money and impact are key to any business case. Considerations to support investment, especially where there's ongoing investment, because it's not a one-off cost. It needs loving, nurturing, feeding, keeping going. So evidence-based programmes mean we can point to the theory, the science behind the offers, the outcomes of testing or scaling up elsewhere give commissioners confidence that this programme will work for our families, but also there'll be a return on investment. Also, programmes with the inbuilt measures and distance travelled measures really support that ongoing business case. The distance travelled measures also support a self-evaluation for families, which gives them a voice to talk about what the impact has been for them. And there's nothing more powerful than that to feed back to a commissioner. Workforce development was another key driver for us, in that all the staff we've trained are early help practitioners, early years practitioners, or the support staff in schools. So unless you want to go and be a teacher or a social worker, quite often it's a limited career path, and especially if you don't want to lead and manage. Evidence-based programmes give us a real opportunity for practitioners to have a qualification and accreditation to become a specialist, or to lead and develop something across a service or an area. Consistency for families was a key driver for us, so that families get the same messages from a variety of practitioners, that you can revisit messages where a family might be struggling and they are consistent for that family to remember. You can draw them back to things. The things that stay with children and families as their children grow up, so messages that you can continue to build on. But also, our workforce do have leave, they sometimes go sick, they sometimes unfortunately leave you. So when a new lead professional or a new worker steps in, being able to deliver the same kind of parenting message is really key. Increasing capacity. So when we developed our early health strategy, it was about improving practice, consistency and outcomes, but it was also about supporting capacity across the whole system, stopping the need for individual practitioners to be doing parenting in the home, which is often a request from social workers, parenting in the home. Reducing the demand on family workers so that they could be doing more early help work, more parenting programmes, rather than working on individual families, unless that family needs it. But it was also about supporting the wider partnership, where they become the lead professional for a family, and the plans that they develop with families, that they've got something to tap into, to add into their plan and support them. We were also conscious that we thinking about something that worked across all levels of need. So right from universal offer that every family, regardless, can access and come together with other parents, but coupled with programmes that really support families that need more support. So things like For Baby's Sake and video interactive guidance. One of the attractive things about an evidence-based programme is the opportunity to work with the provider. They offer the expertise and add capacity to you supporting your planning, your implementation. Those who know more about the programme understand what the challenges might be as you implement, and can support practice development through reflection and support, and in some places observed practice. The other thing that evidence-based programmes have offered us the opportunity is to start small and grow, so you can test something out in place, see if it works, and then you can build up. I'll be longer than 2 minutes, I am really, really sorry. I'll do my best. But our experience, so parenting programmes complement and enhance the support, the system supporting families. Our experience is that programmes work best as part of a whole family package of support. Family plans that address individual needs of children and parents, that consider family relationships and dynamics, and are thoughtful about when parenting programmes kick in. Those are the things that work best for families. Okay. What stops us implementing programmes? Cost. Not just the outlay, but the ongoing nurturing of a programme, keeping it moving when staff move on, reaccreditation where that's needed, clinical supervision and resources. They need an infrastructure, a team that make it happen, staff capacity for time planning, that coordination, all adds to costs, or it means difficult decisions to stop doing something whilst you do that. Longer programmes often get a bad press. Families won't sustain for that long, they won't engage for that length of time, when actually that's really about the relationship between the practitioners and the families in the way that they work together. It takes more time, but often they have really good impact for families. Perceived lack of flexibility of a programme, that fear that things will be very, very rigid and you won't be able to change the messaging, and that it won't fit for your system. That's not something we've experienced. We've been able to have conversations with our colleagues and work around issues, things like swaddling, dummies, and the things that affect your UNICEF accreditation, and babies not being in the space whilst you're delivering a parenting programme. We were able to negotiate those to make sure they work for our families. Workforce. they have to want to do it. You have to have a group of people that are going to love, nurture and work with you in delivering programmes. So people like Lisa, Susie and Vicky are the people that make it happen. And perception about families. There was a really strong perception about families wanting to access groups in Blackpool. They won't come. Well, they do, and they come in regularly and maintaining themselves in programmes because, again, it's about the relationships practitioners build with those families, but the relationships they build with other parents as well. And there is generally a lack of understanding about where parenting sits as that whole system, and we've heard about that earlier today. Gaps. So these were more questions rather than answers, but support for children, support for parents of children with mental health problems. Definitely around school attendance, we're seeing a high level of children who are suffering social anxiety. How do we create a system that works and wraps around those children and families? Neurodiverse parents, parents who experience the world very, very differently to others. How do we support them in this parenting space? How do we deliver something that looks a little bit different for them? Preparation of staff. Delivering and managing group work isn't for everybody, and we have lost staff along the way. But thinking about how we support developing those skills for people, really quite important. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's often a barrier and a blockage. The opportunity for practitioners who are going to deliver parenting programmes to reflect on their own parenting practice can be a real challenge. We all experience parenting in a different way. We have good experiences and some have bad. How do we make sure that they feel comfortable with their parenting style, don't feel guilty and don't worry about what that means when they're delivering parenting programmes? And then better understanding our parents' readiness to fully access parenting programmes, not just being trauma-informed, but trauma-attuned, and that parental conflict and where that sits for that family in how ready they are for parenting programmes. So again, thinking about the whole family, the individuals within it, and the timing of parenting programmes. What would help? So I'm sure the first one's no surprise. Long-term, sustained investment is necessary for us to be able to keep programmes planning, embedding and moving forward. Short-term funding also affects how families view parenting programmes because they're here 1 minute and gone the next because you can't sustain them, and it doesn't build confidence across a community when things are in and out of fashion. Short-term funding expects miracles to happen quickly, have significant impact and then sustain. That's just not achievable with short-term funding. It needs longer term. 10 years of Better Start investments demonstrated that. I do think we need to do more co-production with families, potentially around the families who, parents who experience the world differently, more diverse families. We don't do enough in terms of what do they think would work. That research, consultation, diagnostic kind of approach that we benefited from a Better Start. Again, I do think there's a space for developing something around parenting to support local authorities in their implementation. I don't have a complicated diagram like Crispin, but how do you navigate it? How do you make it work? And a deeper understanding about where parenting sits in the whole system. And I think we've heard others speak about that today. But what we do know is that parents who feel more equipped and confident to parent their children report improved well-being, feeling much more able to deal with the other challenges that life throws at them. Right, sorry.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to have this roundtable discussion. So stay where you are. We're going to have, so on each table, there are 2 members of our team, one who's going to facilitate the discussion and one who's going to take notes. And you have one question on your table that we invite you to discuss as a group. Oh, is there a Slido now? Oh, yeah. Oh, what do you mean? Oh, okay. Anyway, we'll stay here. So there are 4 tables. You'll see which question you have, which have question 1A. What are the key barriers that developers and implementers of parenting interventions currently face? Which barriers to using evidence at scale are most important for us to address? And some of the tables will be, we're asking you to discuss what is our vision for how we can make better use of evidence to drive the effectiveness of parenting support in the early years. So you should have the questions on your tables, and maybe facilitators and note takers, you can introduce yourselves. And yeah, oh yeah, sorry, that's very important. You're supposed to have 30 minutes for the discussion. I'll let you know when we're 3 minutes before that. And then we'll come back as a plenary and ask each table to relate 2 key points very succinctly. Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. Very pleased to introduce a great set of speakers this afternoon to help us move into thinking about solutions in terms of increasing access to parenting interventions. So first up, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Rooney, who many of you will know from the Department for Education. We mentioned in the speeches this morning some bits of government perhaps not having as much as a focus on parenting as we might want at certain times. I'm happy to say Mark is definitely the exception. He leads the work on the 300 million Family Hubs project at the DfE, working jointly with the Department for Health and Social Care. And is going to talk to us about how the government's opportunity mission can help drive scale-up of evidence-based parenting. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Hear me okay? Yeah. I'm probably not going to say very much about the opportunity mission, to be honest, because, early days, but we'll come on to that. Lovely to be here. Thank you very much. Sorry I couldn't join the morning session. A couple of members of my team are here, so I've been caught up. I gather the discussions were rich, as all discussions at conferences must be. But excited to be here and have to talk about and reflect on a few years' worth of work on parenting. It's very echoey. I'm slightly going mad. Okay, right, so I'm sure I'll get used to it. Right, and there's a clicker. There we go. Some section headings. So mostly what this is going to be is me reflecting on the things we've done through various programs we've run over the years, which culminate, I think, in the Family Hubs and Start for Life program, the big one. But we've learned through various different small things that we've done and scaled up over time. So there's a bit of scaling up of our own parental interventions in government over that time. Section 5, as I just alluded to, is excitingly and enticingly titled The Future. A bit of a spoiler, which I've already given, that the future is still very much unknown. But these are exciting times. So I will say some things, and you can guess what I mean. And probably overinterpret. Oh, we've gone backwards. Right. So, as I mentioned, so this is the journey so far. What it should probably be titled is sort of recent history, because my own history with parenting interventions goes back even further than this. I first worked on parenting under the Gordon Brown government. And obviously there was a huge amount of work happened around parenting at that time. My colleague who's here, Rox, and I worked on it again in the days of the coalition. And that was on a more of an outward curve where we had to close down a lot of things that were done. It was around the time of the Camp Parent trials, very different kind of approach conceptually to this policy area. There's also not a complete treatment of the subject because there are other things happening. Supporting Families programme. I was involved at some point with, I see South London and Maudsley are here, the sort of scale up of MST in children's social care. So there's a huge amount of history in this area, and this is a bit of a selective period. But what this is a sort of the re-emergence, I think, of parenting policy in the Department for Education, which starts, I think, with the Social Mobility Action Plan under Justine Greening, where the department had gone, as people know, broadly when Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove were here, it slimmed itself down from the DCSF, Children's Schools and Families, into education. The Social Mobility Action Plan marks the point at which the department started to go back into this area, led inexorably by the evidence, which I think it's a testament to the evidence in this area that it cannot be ignored for very long. And so over the time I've been back in early years and families group as it is now, incrementally we have been building back and had different kinds of approach. I won't go through all of this, but the Social Mobility Action Plan, we did a series of work under Damien Hines on the home learning environment. We had a big summit of business partners. We had the campaign Hungry Little Minds. We did some work with a local government programme, which is an LGA thing, where we were trying to improve early language outcomes through looking at systems. We then went into COVID. We had the Early Years Education Recovery Programme, which was a response to obviously the lost learning, which we were able to bid for some money to get home learning environment interventions as part of the catch-up, which we then, when we had a series of opportunities through Andrea Ledsam's review and the interest of the then ministers in moving back to this area, and a manifesto commitment in 2019 around family hubs, the opportunity to continue to make the case for parenting, family, and other kinds of interventions as part of a rounded programme. And it's the learning from all of this that we took into the £300 million Start for Life and Family Hubs programme. I'm just going to click the order on one. I imagine most people here, many of you I know, are familiar with Family Hubs and Start for Life programme, but just by way of brief introduction, it's a joint programme with the Department for Health and Social Care and the DFE, which is possibly its primary strength. We run it's in 75 local authorities, 300 million over 3 years, of which this is the final funded year of the original slug of money. It breaks down into various different work strands. There's 80 million or so for the creation of a network of family hubs, and effectively what that's about is kind of strategic transformation of those services. And then there was specific pots of money for areas, some of which were tied to Andrea Ledsam's critical 1001 days agenda and review, and some of them were a bit more broad. As I say, there's 28 million for home learning environment interventions, 50 million pounds for parenting, including programmes, 50 million pounds for infant feeding, 100 million pounds for infant parent mental health and relationship support in those critical 1001 days, and some other bits that fall off that. So Family Hubs is very much a programme about transforming local services for families with an emphasis on the early years, but taking on what was Sure Start and taking it into an all-age range model, but the emphasis very much still on that early years. We built that programme around some principles because we recognised that every local authority was starting from a different place in terms of the legacy of their children's centres and the local offer. So what we're trying to do, some places had closed all their children's centres, some places had retained a lot of investment in our model. What we were trying to do was just to say that the government had also had a period of time, as I've said, where it's sort of really stepped back from that policy area, and our knowledge of what was happening was quite low. So what this phase of the programme is partly about is building a model, making some first steps to build back some capacity, some space for strategic transformation, and reducing the kind of constellation of different approaches to get something that's a bit more recognisably and consistently a thing, and to make as much impact as we could along the way. So just flicking back, we got the money, the £300 million was announced in November of 2021, which was presented us with a big opportunity and also a big problem, because the government's appetite for delivery of family hubs was, and speed around that was, huge. We didn't have very much time to get the money out to local authorities before the funding period started in the April afterwards, and every moment that we spent doing policy development meant that money wasn't being used on the ground. So a lot of the policy design that we did around this time was very quick. It was COVID time. I think we were all working at home. I remember my mental sense of what was happening when we were doing all of this work is that I'm in my loft in the dark because it's winter and I was at home all the time. So, very different kind of from where we are now in this room. And that probably did, I think, play into the way between the speed and the nature of that time. A lot of the decisions around the design of that program were taken very internally, very quickly, but built on that kind of history of learning that I've sort of just talked about. And some of the things that we were, in terms of trade-offs and choices in the design, are things that I know we've discussed already. So, how do you best balance the need for local kind of ownership of programs and the central mandation and standards and quality? The sort of three key lessons that we took from some of the history and from the evidence is that just mandating funding stuff isn't enough. You need local ownership to secure effective delivery, and to optimise success, it's best to integrate your parenting interventions and other interventions within the local service delivery. And that then informed this design, as I've mentioned. Obviously, there were some known challenges which we would have covered, sort of stigma and sort of the leading time for scaling up interventions, and our lack of knowledge even of workforce capacity, but the workforce capacity that had been lost over the period of time over that decade. And inevitably, we were faced with a 3-year funding pot, which is fantastic compared to what was there before, but still only 3 years, and that's a time-limited challenge. So how do you best intelligently design something that meets those challenges? This is what we sort of came up with in terms of the principles. The parenting funding I'll focus on here. The home learning environment funding is related but different, and because of the way we got that, there were some different rules applied. If we just think about the parenting money for now, which is about £50 million within the lump, if you like, what we said to local authorities, we gave them national guidance, but a lot of local flexibility. There was an attempt to, as I say, recognise that every local authority was starting from a different place, and allow to create this framework of standards, but allow each local authority to own that funding and build it onto whatever offer was there locally. There's a huge emphasis on evaluation. We put about £5 million into the evaluation of all of this, and that evaluation is happening now. So trying to strike this balance through minimum expectations and a model of, you go further from this menu. We gave local authorities the money to pick, but we insisted that they used the Early Intervention Foundation guidebook to select their interventions. We had no choice but to put some conditions on the age range and cohorts for those programs as a constraint upon us from the nature of the way we got the money. That bit was a bit less popular. We mostly have stuck really clearly to a requirement for programs within allowing local authorities to create an expectation they create. A wider holistic parenting offer, which includes some elements of peer support, some place-based sort of community work, and the programs themselves. So trying to give local authorities the flexibility, insisting on programs, but within a context of building out their national offer from their starting point. The other bits of the programme, we did do some other things I just might mention briefly, particularly on the DHSC side around parenting relationships, where some national programmes were procured and offered to local authorities. Kind of different scaling approach. But for the DFE angle in this joint programme, that's what we did. So obviously I had a look at the incredibly helpful report that has been produced and did a bit of how did we do against the enablers that are identified within it. I'll start with a direct quote from that report. So it says, in contrast, the experts interviewed for this research cite improvement in multiple key areas. The Family Hubs and Start for Life programme is the clearest example of this improvement. I thank you very much. I'm sure the author of that report is here. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my agent, my family. I would say there's a bit of a selective code, but going back to the start, I think that particularly refers to the fact that the government, has very significantly in this programme joined two departments together, giving one grant with some clear instructions, and that's what everyone wants to see, and that join up has been really important, and want to very much see that as, and have pitched it within government lately as an example of mission-centred mission government in practice, as you would expect me to do. But just very briefly to sort of touch on some of the other key enablers. So the context I've talked about a bit, we did well to, I think, have that national integration between departments. I think the balance we struck between standards and national requirements, but allowing local authorities to position their programmes within their local offer, different views about that, but I think we struck a good balance. The reflections for the sort of the national context, of course, the short-term funding is a problem that and continues to be. We're operating on 3-year spending review timetables. That's a constraint that we all recognise. And I think some of there is a discussion to be had about just some of the requirements we put on about age cohorts. But whether and the extent of flexibility we gave to allow local authorities to pick non-funded programmes that weren't on the EIF guidebook, now Foundations, as long as they had a credible route to assess and evaluate those programmes as a means to grow the pipeline. I think we got the right balance there, but I think you could think about it for future funded programmes. In terms of the resource team, a lot of this was locally led, partly through expediency, but partly because we wanted these programmes to be really embedded in the local offer. And again, I think that was a strength, but that meant that government we haven't done a lot to think about the capacity challenges and the workforce challenges centrally that exist when you're implementing those programmes. The models, I think we have rested very heavily on the work centres as a sort of proxy for quality. Again, local choice. So centrally, we're not taking a very strong view about which programmes beyond that sort of quality indicator, if you like, as provided by the work centres and the assessment of the evidence that underpins them. And then finally, sort of recipients. I think the strength of the Family Hub's approach and citing your parenting intervention scaling within that model, as opposed to some of the things that government I've seen done where they pick an intervention and try and push it, I think has a lot of strength in terms of the way in which parents receive that intervention. But there's much more we can do to learn about, to gather the evidence around what is effective practice in Family Hubs for doing this kind of work. The one thing that you will not see in there is lots of data. So a lot of this is very impressionistic at this point, and obviously builds on what we know and we've learned in our engagement with local authorities. We have huge amounts of data coming in for this programme, but it's incredibly lagged. So one of the things we definitely did find was that the infrastructure for gathering data in local authorities, like many things, has simply just been lost because of the funding challenges. And this is the work of a long time to build all this stuff back. So we did allow the transformation funding to be used for data collection. As I say, we have a very big national evaluation. We will have a lot of really good management information about what programs were used, how many people were on them, and that will allow us to do lots of good, exciting cost-benefit analysis work eventually. And the calibre of that data will be a challenge, but I think we've got good stuff coming. We designed it in, but I think the challenges around data collection, gathering and analysis in a timely way in this sector are huge. And so one I think we can look to for the future. So this is the future slide, and this is a bit where hopefully I've managed some expectations about what we're going to say. There are two things I would draw people's attention to. Prime Minister gave a speech in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago, where there's a bit in bold. He's talking here about, in broad terms, about the missions. The section in bold is meaningful. But I can't say very much more about that. The government is going to say some more about missions at some prescribed time in the future, which keeps changing. But what you can take from that statement is the centrality of early years. And anyone who's heard the Secretary of State speak on any of the media rounds will hear her say repeatedly, early years is my #1 priority. And so the space we find ourselves at, what is, as always, an exciting time, is a genuinely exciting one. The level of political buy-in for this area and the basic case is made within government. which takes you onto the budget. So the budget says in the documents that there is £69 million to continue delivery of a network of family hubs next year. Now, everybody wants to know what that number means, and it doesn't talk about Start for Life. I can't say very much about that because we had to go through a set of loops with ministers on it. Effectively, however, what I do want to say is please don't read too much into the things that are not said. We had an opportunity to say something about family hubs and the future funding, which we took because one of the things we know local authorities are facing, and it speaks to one of the obvious difficulties in this world of the short-term funding, is that, you know, April is coming up and people are making, in very constrained financial circumstances, decisions about next year. So we took an opportunity that we, the DfE, had to say something about some money for next year. That opportunity was not available to all other actors who have funding. That doesn't mean that that funding is more in doubt or less in doubt. It just means that those departmental processes have to play out. So please don't read anything into the absence, but do read something into the presence, which is that the government has said, you know, we will be taking forward a family hubs programme, and there will be a funded programme next year. So obviously that brings us on to the idea about, well, what does that mean for the question at hand, which is scaling parenting interventions? And I think next year I expect, it's only a one-year assessment because this was a one-year spending review. So I would not expect huge radical change to what's happening at the moment and the way the programme is currently operating on the parenting side. It will give us an opportunity to sort of sustain and embed things we're doing. There will then be a spending review which runs into spring of next year, which, you know, could run as far as late as the summer, of course. And that is where there's a very interesting opportunity to reflect on the findings of this report, the things we have learned, and to think also about a bit more broader than the programme. So the programme was a huge opportunity with some targeted investment. The direct grants to local authorities solves one problem, which is how do you keep money at that end of the system when it is, you know, obviously the demands of statutory services for anything that's pooled are incredibly high. So it has had that huge advantage of being able to allow local professionals and advocates to keep that money in this bit and do this work, and that's a huge value already. However, of course, there is a disadvantage with a funding system that runs through grants. We're only talking about one bit of the money that's spent on these types of services. There's a public health grant, there's existing money for the LGFS. We still don't have great data about, you know, how that all works. But the long run future here is probably not for incremental bits of programme everywhere. It's got to be in a more intelligent relationship between local government and what is charmingly described in the report as outer government, I think, which is an interesting inversion compared to central government. So yeah, the relationship there is a wider context for how we solve this particular problem around parenting, and indeed all sorts of thinking about integrated family services and early intervention going forward. But as I say, the world we are in now, as we come to do the bid for the next phase of the SR, and then indeed to design that programme in detail, is very different from me in my bedroom. You know, here we are, and the reason why I'm here, my team are here, is because over this next period of time, we have a huge opportunity in terms of the political capital behind this agenda, with the beginnings of some money. I don't think anybody read the budget last week or the coverage around it and will think that you know, there are enormous billions about to flow into any corner of the public sector. We're going to be, you know, growing incrementally if we can and making the case within, you know, a context of constraining resources for some time to come. But, you know, we are incredibly well positioned to do that through both the opportunity mission and as I say, the political capital that we more generally have on this area. And the opportunity ways of working, sort of mission-based ways of working as well, is itself another kind of opportunity. Still early days for all of that. Very much the government trying to work out and give a bit more flesh on the bone to the missions, and then we will get on to, I think, how does that flow through into design choices, including around, you know, the central-local relationship, innovation, test and learn, evidence. All those things are under sort of, you know, within the literature around mission-centred government that we will then try and apply as we move forward through the next Parliament. So I think that's it from me. You know, delighted to be here, and I think this is generally, I think probably officials are prone to kind of standing on these things and saying it's a terribly exciting time, but I think it generally is an exciting time, and I look forward to working with you all on the next iteration, even more than we managed to last time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So useful to have an overview of the policy and your reflections. And we did realise you wouldn't be able to say too much about the Opportunity Mission, but you can't blame us for trying. I'm going to move us on quite swiftly because we are a little bit behind on time. Next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kirsten Asmussen. Kirsten is head of Toolkit Synthesis at Foundations. So Kirsten and her team assess the strength of evidence behind the different interventions that sit on the Foundations guidebook. She is also a leading authority on parenting interventions, so look forward to hearing what she'll have to say. And Kirsten is going to talk to us about what we can learn from national actions seeking to promote evidence use.
Thanks, Donna. Can people hear me? Yep. Okay, great. First of all, I want to just thank Nesta for inviting me to come here and talk. And I also want to thank them for the speaking notes that they sent my way a few weeks ago. Quite often I get asked to talk about parenting interventions and how great they are and the evidence underpinning them. And sometimes I bore people to tears with conversations about evidence standards. And actually those came up at our table earlier today. But today they asked me to talk about something that I like even more, and that's the past. And the fun part about this is the past that I'm going to talk about ends just where Mark picked up, and I didn't even know that, okay? So you're going to get a wonderful timeline. I hope I don't bore you to tears because I could be here all afternoon. But nevertheless, we are going to talk with the past, and we're going to go back 100 years now as time travelers to the 1920s when B.F. Skinner was very popular, but there were some observational studies that showed that when parents were nice to their children and gave them a warm, supportive, and sensitive environment, that their children improved. Their behavior improved, they were happier, they seemed to be healthier, and there were more positive family relationships. And that was really kind of an important landmark observational study. Then, I'm not going to say much about what happened in the middle, but I think it is fair to say that up until the 60s, that policy actually led on this rather than evaluation studies. That you had denizens such as John Bowlby and Donald Winnicott, denizens of the parenting field, that really had the government's ear, and there were some very good policies based on their research and also their ideas on both sides of the pond that took the agenda forward. We get to the 1960s, and we have actually our first parenting interventions. Most of them were based upon therapeutic evidence, some of it which was more evidence-based than others, but nevertheless, there was evidence to show, and some intuitive findings as well, that suggest that when that this support provided to parents that changed parents' behaviors had measurable positive benefits for children. Come to the 70s, and you get Archibald Cochran involved in things, and everything becomes evidence-based. And we start to find out how strong that evidence is. First, through observational studies that showed how differences in parent-child interaction improved or didn't improve parent-child outcomes. We have something called the HANF principles coming into place in the mid-70s, which are basically the core elements of most of the most effective interventions, including many of which were mentioned today, Incredible Years, Triple P, et cetera. And so already by 1982, you have your first systematic review showing that parenting interventions are effective. And the 80s saw huge investment in the development of these interventions. That's when FMP was first trialed in the United States, as well as Incredible Years. And Matt Sanders and colleagues in Australia embarked upon a very rigorous program evaluation for their model as well. Many similarities in these models, but just to say that they all have the same principles, but the principles in amongst themselves do not make an evidence-based program. It's about how they're put together, and this is something that was discovered already in the 80s. By the time you get to the 90s, there's widespread acceptance of the fact that parenting interventions play a very important role in terms of supporting children's mental health, and that if offered at scale at the population level, you may start to see very important public health benefits. So actually there was quite a bit of international consensus about this in 1996, and already by the time the Blair-Brown administration is elected, they are announcing Sure Start, and another initiative that many of us may have forgotten about, but on track, that morphed into the Children's Fund, which was about making sure that evidence-based family interventions were offered at scale for older children. So you have it across the board. What happened? Okay. Still working? Okay. Across the board for children during the 2000s. And so I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned about that. And also, just to say, we get then to 2007 when the RESPECT agenda is in place and we have the Parent Early Intervention Pathfinders and NAP. We've got the launch of FMP. We also have the launch of Flying Start in Wales. And then we get to 2012, and that's when Nesta comes in really because they galvanize the thinking about the What Work Centers, who I represent today. So before we get into what happened in the UK over the last 20 years, I want to talk a little bit about Norway and the United States to give us a bit of a compare and contrast. Because at the end of the 90s, there was a huge amount of international enthusiasm about offering parenting interventions at scale. And Norway was a leader in this space. Now, what they did is they decided that they were going to do something quite central. And that meant that all local authorities had to offer basically the same thing. They couldn't choose the model that they offered, but they could choose how much of the model that they offered. And so at the lower end of need, they made sure that there were parenting practitioners in place in all local areas through all schools so that families had access to parenting support as and when they needed. The primary model was the Parent Management Training Program developed in Oregon. And then at the higher end of need, you had multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, and treatment foster care Oregon. So there was a continuum, but there was no choice in the continuum. And interestingly, at a conference in 2007, the Norwegian equivalent of the Minister of Children came and spoke, and people asked him, why aren't you giving local areas a choice? And he said, because they would make the wrong one. So it was very much nationally driven. There wasn't a lot of choice there, but also a huge amount of investment in setting up the infrastructure. PMTO pioneered their train-the-trainer models there, so it was sustainable, and also a huge investment in very rigorously conducted RCTs to show that each step that they took was evidence-based. Now, one thing that they don't have RCT evidence for is whether or not that made a difference at the population level. They do have monitoring evidence that suggests that it's true, so I guess they believe that it's true, and they think that there has been now, as a result of this year-on-year investment, reduced pressure on both the youth justice system and children's social care. Then we get to the United States, which were actually where we get some of our first evidence-based clearinghouses, and also the huge demonstration projects that suggested, evaluations that suggested that activities such as FMP and some of the other interventions, HIPPY, I believe, and MST were effective in a variety of different areas. But then they left it up to the states to trial and test different models. And interestingly, they found, again, we had an evidence-based growing, but it was at the local level. So fundamentally, for example, Prosper and Communities That Care, this is a model that gives local areas some choice from a menu. It was run in various states, randomized at the county level, and it showed that model, not the interventions itself, but the model with evidence-based interventions as access to those evidence interventions was effective. Now, a key feature of that model is what they called technical assistance, which is not a very attractive term for what we might call here as a local champion or a local leader who knows a lot about the evidence, but also the intervention models that helps join the two together to make sure that they are embedded in the local systems in a way that makes sense and reach the families that need them the most. So that is a critical aspect to the use of evidence-based parenting interventions. I also want to mention the statewide trial of Triple P in South Carolina, which showed that the counties that implemented Triple P were less likely to have demand on the children's social care system than the counties that didn't have it. Now, can you attribute that to the program model? I think they make a convincing case. So we see here not just interventions themselves on their own contributing to improvements in children's outcomes from the RCTs that had taken place, but these models for embedding and implementing systems that also make a difference. So I want to highlight that here. Finally, I'm just going to make a mention that the state of California, they have this ACE and AWARE initiative, And that actually, through various questionnaires, some of which are more robust than others, they're making sure that families have access to these interventions. And that's a Kamala Harris initiative. So I just thought I'd give that a plug as well, because it is increasing access to them. And fingers crossed. So what are the key features from this model? First of all, huge investment going all the way back to the 80s to identify the most effective models and test them over and over and over again with many different populations. So you have not RCT evidence from one time in one place, but over in different places, so you can get a good idea about what works for whom and under what circumstances. The other thing is that many of these models, yeah, they're local, but they were developed in universities based on NIH and NSF funding that actually fueled what we would call in the medical sciences bench work. So they were fueling, they were paying for observational studies that noticed that when parents who treated their children one way had better outcomes than parents who didn't. And those observational studies were then used and put into the intervention models that were tested. So there's a clear pipeline starting with universities, tested actually locally, but then brought to scale nationally. And then sorry, I lost my thought. I got to look down there. There was investment also in national scale up after the findings from these studies, principally in 2000, but I should mention that the Title IV-E Act, now most recently for the Prevention Clearinghouse, Home V, and the Criminal Crime Solutions, these clearinghouses are part of very federally funded entitlements. They're actually federal law now, so they're bipartisan. They can't be taken out of law, much in the same way that Head Start is, that money is given to the states if, ring-fence funding, if they use one of the interventions on these clearinghouses. The clearinghouses are all now federally funded, and there is a very clear pipeline for interventions to get onto the clearinghouses. So the clearinghouses play a very important role of helping areas identify interventions that work based on their local need, but it's not the whole story. They're part of a policy lever that funds the intervention in a way that's not completely dissimilar from what Mark just described with the Family Hubs model. So let's talk about the United Kingdom. And first, let's start with Sure Start. It was an incredibly ambitious policy and probably rivaled any of the other policies that I described before. It was announced in 1998, 1997, and children's centers then were introduced in 2004. So we started out with the 250 most deprived local areas, and then by 2004 it was going to be rolled across the country. So a huge amount of investment. I couldn't find one document that gave me the total. If somebody here knows it and you want to shout it out, please do. And then so one of the things that was found early on that this didn't necessarily ensure take-up of evidence-based interventions. In 2007, we had the National Academy for Parenting Practitioners and the Family Nurse Partnership announced to further reinforce those messages. Now, it's fair to say that Sure Start wasn't the same as Head Start, but it was informed by some of the thinking or the findings from the long-term national evaluation of Head Start and also Perry Preschool, two different but related initiatives in the United States, both showing long-term benefits from the family recipients who got those programs in the 60s, showing improvements, measurable, costable improvements 20, 30, 40 years later. Now, one thing to say about both of those models is that they're fairly rigid. And even the Head Start, for example, there is some local flex to it, but local areas have to apply for the funding. They have to go through a very lengthy application process to get the money. And then they show how they're going to reach their population. They have to fulfill many, many different requirements before that funding is granted. And once they fulfill all those requirements and those questions are answered, they get some software that allows them to monitor their progress through the interventions. Interestingly, in the early days of Sure Start, that's when I started in this country as an evaluator, we didn't get software, but we also had to monitor our outcomes. We had to report on a quarterly basis, and we came up with our own software to do it, but it was important. It was actually, I would say that it was a very important part of the evaluation that we did as part of that initiative. I can't really read this down here, sorry about that. But another important feature of Sure Start was that local areas were encouraged to innovate, and in fact, the phrase "let 1,000 flowers bloom" was common. So the idea was that you wouldn't necessarily have one single model, but you would develop your own. And it's fair to say that in 2005, 2006, when the first national evaluation findings came in, they were fairly disappointing. It's showing that, in fact, Sure Start probably didn't make any difference when compared to the outcomes of children in comparable neighborhoods or areas, and also that the use of evidence-based interventions wasn't as widespread as the government had originally hoped. In 2008, the findings were a little bit better, but nevertheless, there were concerns about whether or not the initiative was fulfilling the objectives that people had hoped. There were findings also in the evaluation that the lack of evidence-based interventions could, and the lack of focus, could have actually contributed to the negative results. And there was one evaluation also showed that there was an active prejudice against the use of evidence-based interventions, which seemed to work against what we would refer to as today as evidence use. Nevertheless, it's not all doom and gloom. As people know now, the findings, the long-term findings, appear to be much more positive, and we are seeing that that investment probably did pay off in the lives of some of the families that lived in those communities. But at the time, the findings were very disappointing. Michael Rutter, in particular, wrote an article about what he thought went wrong and where things could be improved. And specifically, he felt that the lack of emphasis, the lack of a specific target group or a specific set of goals contributed to the lack of effectiveness. There was no consistency in any of the models, so it was difficult for quality assurance. Poor attention to the evidence base. And so he suggested that going forward, that there should be a universal offer, but much more targeting within it, and that there needed to be greater investment in the workforce also to make sure that it could be delivered to a high standard. Now let's talk about the National Academy for Parenting Practitioners. Sorry, I'm really having difficulty seeing the slides. So it was launched in 2007 with a group of academics and at the Institute of, I'm sorry, I can't read this. Between Parenting UK, the Family and Parenting Institute, and King's College, and I would refer to them as the Albert Schweitzers of parenting interventions. It was considered to be a center of excellence for this work, and the idea was to train. It was unprecedented, actually, in the field of parenting interventions, in that it aimed to train over 4,000 parenting practitioners in one of 10 evidence-based models. I'm not going to go into the details of this to say, but to say that they were all trained, but unfortunately in 2010 when the training was completed, that the uptake of parenting interventions was a bit disappointing. We found that after all that training, it was within 6 months of the training, only 42% of the practitioners went on to deliver a parenting intervention, and after that, it dwindled by again another half. So that was not what people had expected. But just think about the scope of that training and how many individuals had been trained after that first 6 months. That had reached over, by estimates, if these are all group-based interventions, at least 10,000 families, if not 15. So it did reach quite a few of them. And so what did we learn about the training? What embedded it? What helped it make place? And to cut to the quick here, it was about the support that the practitioner had in post. Interestingly, back then we had these parenting commissioners who could have provided the go-between between the local areas and the evidence-based models. That didn't work as effectively as we had hoped it would at the time. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't work going forward, but it really was down to the agency that was sponsoring the parenting intervention, the supervisor, and the time that the supervisor had given the practitioner to deliver the intervention. And I think one thing that drives home about this is that these are not, yes, they're group-based models, but for them to be effective and for families to attend them, they need to be personalized. And that personalization takes time, and that time requires capacity. And so if the practitioner didn't have it, they couldn't do that. And that could be also, I think, a key link as to why some of these interventions don't work as well as they could on the ground, is that the capacity just isn't there to deliver them as they should be. Go through this very quickly now because I know we're running out of time. Yeah, I know. So just talk very briefly about FMP. FMP was also started in 2007. Incredible enthusiasm for the intervention. Practitioners loved it. Families loved it too. In 2016, there was evidence to suggest that it didn't work. In fact, at least it didn't at the time, against the outcomes that were measured. There were 3 outcomes, though, that are important to keep in mind, and that was improvements in children's early mastery motivation and their language skills, as well as the family's access to services. Fast forward 5 years later, and we find that, no, the findings were disappointing in terms of the child maltreatment outcomes that they were looking for, but they did, as Donna said earlier today, demonstrate improvements in children's learning capabilities at reception and then at key stage 4. And the reason that these are important is that's why the intervention is 2.5 years long. You could get the maternity outcomes with a 6-month intervention. Those are the ones that the national evaluation looked at. But you need the 2.5-year ones to support children's early language development. And so that's why it made a difference. So just cutting to the quick here, what makes a difference in terms of scaling up interventions? Well, if we compare the UK model to the international model, we see that a large upfront investment, both are the same on that. But it's the continued investment that really seems to make some of the difference. Also, the ongoing ring fencing. I know some areas don't like it, but we can see if we compare ourselves, and I know it's not an RCT, but if we compare ourselves to other countries, we can see that actually that ring fencing, it plays an important incentive role, as do clearinghouses as part of that. And clearinghouses form 2, they provide the areas with a choice, but they also have information about what doesn't work, and so they perform sort of a watchdog purpose as well. Finally, there's also, you can see a difference in terms of the continued investment, not just in large-scale evaluations, but monitoring. In this respect, RCTs are not the end of the evaluation line for intervention, but really just the beginning, because the monitoring not only tells you if the intervention remains effective, but it tells you who it's effective for, under what circumstances, et cetera, so you can flex at the local level. And so one thing I can really say by looking at, in comparison us to these other countries, is that they give, in the setup, the monitoring infrastructure for that to take place. It was very interesting to hear that this has been part of the early parts of the Family Hubs initiative, and I'm going to suggest that that continue. Thanks very much.
We think about inequality and diversity in scaling up parenting interventions. I'm delighted to introduce Leandra Box, who is the Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Programmes at the Race Equality Foundation. Leandra's work includes developing, implementing and evaluating the Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities programme, which has been designed to effectively engage families from Black, Asian and minoritised backgrounds. Thank you so much, Leandra.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I'm just gonna, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. You've had an introduction to me already, but just to say something about the Race Equality Foundation. So we're an evidence-based policy and practice charity working to tackle racism and racial inequalities. And I'll leave it there, but we're also the home of the Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities programme. So I'm going to be drawing on that as well. Just a couple of things before I start. So the title of the presentation that was given to me was taking account of diversity and inequalities in Scale Up, and I've taken it upon myself to change the title, so I hope that's okay. So you'll see diversity has been replaced by references to systemic racism. I think it's important to put that front and centre. Diversity is a word that is incredibly comfortable for most people, and this isn't a comfortable thing to talk about. We shouldn't be comfortable with inequality. So I just wanted to say that, and also to reflect on my sort of unique position, working for an organisation with both expertise in inequality and the impact of racism, but also expertise on parenting. As I said, we're the home of Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities, and we're also a by and for organisation, and by that I mean an organisation with a predominantly minoritized staff group and board, working on behalf of marginalised groups. So I suppose I have skin in the game, and I just wanted to acknowledge that, but don't let it diminish what I'm going to say. So what I plan to talk about, I am going to be looking at some of the challenges presented in Equitable Scale Up, explore the impact of systemic racism on that, talk about the experience of by and for organisations and their role in successful scale up, because I think that's a really crucial part of the puzzle if we want to get this right, and more generally look at what we can do to address these issues and be intentional about equity. So, a few quotes there, but essentially, just 3 key points, and I won't labour them. One, as we've already heard from the other speakers, we've got plenty of evidence that effective parenting interventions work and deliver desirable public health outcomes. Secondly, that an inclusive approach is critical in delivering public health outcomes for all. And lastly, that without an equity lens, scaling will embed existing structural inequality. What the Race Health Observatory refer to as the forces that create and reinforce these inequalities in the first place. So, we've already heard about Sure Start, but I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the kinds of things that can happen when we try to scale up with a couple of examples. So, both Sure Start and the sort of vaccine rollout, and I use that because it's very sort of still vivid in our minds, highlight how large-scale interventions can often fail to reach minoritized communities equitably. So you can feel free to read. I'm not going to go through them. But the vaccine rollout exposed kind of significant disparities with vaccine uptake for minority communities, disproportionately lower than their white counterparts. And those communities facing greater barrier to access due to a range of issues like, mistrust, lack of culturally relevant outreach and communication strategies, and inequitable distribution of vaccination sites, medical professionals, vaccines, those kinds of things. We've already heard with Sure Start that, the evidence is mixed, and certainly the more recent evidence says some positive things about minoritized communities having benefited, but certainly there was evidence in disparities in the uptake and experience of Sure Start, and this is documented in a number of places, revealing lower engagement and access among certain ethnic groups, and certainly in that last point, the most recently about how things work when scale up is scaled down. So it's also about scaling down as well, where we saw that minoritized groups were disproportionately affected by services being scaled back in poorer areas. So, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, these reductions impacted accessibility for the families most in need, undermining the programme's goal of reducing inequalities. So that's a backdrop to just talking a bit about systemic racism. And by this, I'm referring to the racism embedded in the systems and institutions of society that manifest through policies, laws, and practices that perpetuate inequalities and disadvantage for minoritized groups. So I think there are sort of 4 areas that I just wanted to briefly talk about. Access, delivery, the kind of resource allocation, and then some of the kind of policy areas. And luckily for me, coming so late in the day, people have already spoken about loads of this. So just to reiterate maybe some of it. So in terms of that access issue, so systemic racism can result in minoritized groups being less likely to access public services due to mistrust of institutions, as I've mentioned. So that's often rooted in the kind of historical and contemporary experiences of discrimination within the health and social care systems. Different kinds of barriers, such as language barriers, the lack of appropriate services, and so on. And then sort of in some geographical disparities as well, so where you're more likely to live, being more disadvantaged, often underserved by the sorts of infrastructure that's needed. And this can mean that even as services scale up, they may not reach the communities that they need to effectively due to these kinds of resource distribution patterns, for example. So that's the first point in terms of delivery. So I think there's a couple of things. One is on failure to tailor or to select appropriate interventions for communities. So whether at that sort of specific cultural, language, or other needs of ethnic minority communities. But we also see it in a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. So where we don't consider the context that minority groups can be living in and their particular needs. So we've seen it in a number of public health campaigns, the smoking cessation campaigns, for example, and how Bangladeshi men, for example, don't experience the same outcomes as others. So I think that this one-size-fits-all is actually really crucial in the parenting space, and I think it's a real problem in terms of the commissioning processes, as someone who sort of experiences that. So just wanted to make that point. Talking about the kinds of inequalities in funding and resource allocation, this is crucial too. Underfunding of targeted interventions or inclusive initiatives, so interventions designed to address the specific needs of ethnic minority groups are often underfunded. And there's certainly an issue about the way that systemic racism works to influence how those resources are allocated. So we see, as I've mentioned, a lack of investment in areas where you might find minoritized populations, as we saw with Sure Start, where the scaling down took place. And then that leads to a kind of reduction in ability to meet the needs of those communities. I think there's also a question around data and how we use that, and that fits into how we fund things and where we allocate resources. So the lack of data that hampers the ability to understand and address health disparities, and that oversight makes it difficult to scale services in a way that meets the diverse needs of these groups. And I think that's compounded by biases in sort of decision making and the way that decision makers then use data or don't to reflect on their decisions, assessing how reach and impact affects minoritized groups. Last point is on those sort of policy level barriers. So I think lack of inclusive policy frameworks is key. The absence of kind of these robust frameworks that mandate inclusive, culturally competent services, and sort of accountability structures as well that address those kinds of disparities is really important. So I just wanted to sort of summarize what I saw as being some of the areas where we see systemic racism impacting. So I wanted to reflect for a minute on what that feels like for by and for organisations delivering parenting interventions. And there's a whole long list there, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But as I mentioned, I'm sort of uniquely placed to comment on this. We sort of, one of the things that we do is also we work with a whole network of voluntary community and faith-based organisations. So we have lots of feedback on that too. And we have been involved ourselves in a number of attempts to scale up. So all the things that Kirsten was talking about, you know, from the parent and early intervention programme to On Track and so on. and can parent, as Mark referenced earlier. So we have a sense of kind of how that works in practice. So just a few of them I wanted to address. And top of the list, and this wasn't in no particular order, and I ran out of space, so there were plenty more to add. So the first thing is organisations like ours get asked to plug a gap frequently. And I know I've got a colleague here who's nodding, who manages the Approachable Parenting programme, and I know that she has the same kinds of issues. So what happens is you get asked late in the day, we haven't managed to hit targets, we haven't managed to deliver to this particular group, can you come and help us? You fly in, you meet the targets for them, and then they say thank you very much, goodbye. So you're on the receiving end of a one-off bit of funding or short-term funding. There's no sort of sustainability. You're not seen as part of the core service, and the number of commissioners that have told me you're nice to have rather than core to their parenting offer. And that funding element is sort of runs through a number of those. So things like specialist funding. So you can be funded for your intervention because you fit the prevent agenda this year, or you fit the work that's suddenly being done on gangs and reducing youth violence. And that lasts for a year or two, and it goes. And the programme that you've tried to implement in a particular area goes with it. So that's a frequent experience. The issue of being funded in arrears and paid late, that happens as well. Smaller by and for organisations cannot function like that. So it makes it incredibly difficult. What else have we got there? Yes, your service disappears first when there are cuts. That happens a lot too. And then I think just towards the end, so the issue around evidence, because there's been quite a lot of talk about that, just to mention what that, how that sort of plays out, is that often you'll be told you don't have enough evidence when other programmes do, but yet there's never any question of addressing whether the evidence that other interventions might have around meeting the needs of minoritized groups. So they may have evidence, it doesn't necessarily address the needs of minority communities, but it trumps any work or evidence of efficacy that you might have. And even if there's no track record by those of good engagement with marginalised populations. So, sorry, let me go back to my notes. So, I'm going to move on to more positive things, what we can do about it. So this is about how the role of community engagement and by and for organisations is really crucial in supporting scale-up. So we all know, and these basically relate to the elements around community involvement and empowering by and for organisations. And whether you're talking about sort of Marmot, what NHS England says, what Public Health England used to say, community engagement is rolled out regularly as being key to kind of successful delivery of services to any group. So it is important here. And it's things like involving community in the design, implementation and evaluation stages of interventions, and we've heard about that already today, making sure that services are relevant and meeting local needs. It can involve co-production, so ensuring that interventions reflect the lived experience and knowledge of community members. I'm currently working with a colleague here on with a group of fathers with lived experience of being fathers in prison who are helping to develop and adapt our model for delivery in prisons, for example. But that's like absolutely central to the way that we would develop the intervention. So building those sorts of long-term relationships with community leaders and groups, I think, is really important. And then empowering those organisations who have, let's face it, trusted relationships, are often seen as more approachable than some mainstream or statutory agencies, engaging those organisations in the scale-up process ensures that the interventions are more likely to reach underserved groups more effectively. And so providing funding and capacity building support to these sorts of organisations so that they can play a central role in delivering services, I think is really crucial. And those sorts of things impact the other things that I've put up there around how you adapt services, so using those sorts of organisations to help you think about how you provide materials in relevant languages, how you hire staff from within the communities, how you consider a range of issues. So we know, for example, that Sure Start centres were able to better serve ethnic minority families by offering targeted services, language support and so on, more relevant parenting programmes. And that sort of element of thinking about services and doing that in partnership with those by and for organisations is really important. Those organisations can also help us combat mistrust because they bridge the gap quite often. And they can provide safe spaces where groups can access services without fear of discrimination. The bit about inclusive communication, I just wanted to make a point about that, which is that these organisations there's great use of informal networks to disseminate, provide information on services and those sorts of things. But what we must avoid doing is using these organisations as connectors. So you ask them to give you access to the families that they work with, because it's extremely sort of extractive and extractive behaviour, and there's very little sort of funding involved in that. So it becomes, what can you do for us? It doesn't cost you any money. Issues on sort of data collection and monitoring, I think, I took it off my slide, so let me not, I obviously was going to cut down on that. So for flexible and responsive programming, that's the last point I wanted to make, that I think that these organisations can really help us think in terms of regular feedback loops. How do we adjust our services and reshape them and improve them during the scale-up process? Because as we've mentioned earlier today, it needs to be, we're forever evolving on these things, and we need to continually improve. Right, just a little bit on the role of other people in this and the other agencies. So quickly on government, lots of this has already been said. Okay, a couple of minutes, I'll be quick. So providing the vision and mission for government, crucial. Policies that mandate equity, crucial. Allocating sufficient funding to interventions that target disadvantaged groups, important too. Accountability mechanisms to ensure that we're implementing equitably. There are things like equity audits, reviews of service reach, performance tracking, all of this kind of thing. It needs to come from the top. On the issue of funders, we're talking about prioritising investments in underserved communities, providing sustained funding for interventions that have been proven to work in these communities, investing in by and for organisations. Programme developers. So shout out to all the programme developers here, and this includes us. So co-designing interventions with community organisations and those with lived experience to ensure that programmes are fit for purpose. Be clear about who our programmes are designed for and what our evidence says about reach and impact with communities, and let's not overclaim where we don't have the evidence. Let's all be good allies. And using data to continuously monitor who is accessing services and where the gaps are and where they remain, and make sure that we share our data and put it in the public domain. Lastly, local implementers. So, as I've mentioned, actively engaging with local by and for organisations and community groups that have the local knowledge and trust and make them crucial partners in you being able to deliver to your communities. Thinking about locations and time, who you deliver through in terms of who the practitioners are, making sure they meet the needs of marginalised communities, selecting interventions that meet needs, training staff in these models and embedding them, and establishing feedback loops with service users to gather insights and allowing for ongoing dialogue and iterative improvements. So those things really, these are my last calls, addressing inequitable access to services, adapting services, prioritising funding, ensuring transparent reporting on resource distribution, and implementing policies that mandate equity goals in all stages of scaling. That's really my call. And I'll finish with just saying that, which is what I've been saying all along. We're scaling interventions without addressing systemic racism risks reinforcing the very inequalities we aim to reduce. To create lasting, impactful change, we must embed equity at every stage of scale-up, intentionally prioritising minoritized communities and empowering by and for organisations that know and serve these communities best. And only through this equity-driven approach that centres on those historically excluded will we see scaling that can reduce inequality rather than widen it. So that's it, thank you. I'll leave my contact.
Thank you, Leandra. Thank you so much. Loads there for us all to think about and some really helpful suggestions as to what we need to do as we try to move forward on all of this. So thank you.
No, I have to go backwards, is that right? Okay, apparently I have to go backwards to find my slides. Something like that film, Memento. Right, I'm going to try and do this in about slightly under the amount of time which I said I would, which is about 7 minutes. So, local infrastructure for scale. Today, and in Ben's fantastic presentation, we've heard a lot about all of the things that are required for this at a local level, so people, cultures, capacity, systems. In this presentation, I'm going to major in and do a deep dive on data, or we might call it here local evidence, and how that can be used as one of the pillars to effectively scale parenting support. So why do we need to do this? What's the sort of benefit of it all? Well, I think there's a number of bits of the process of scaling an intervention or implementing an intervention that it can help with. So I'm going to turn that off because that's what the echo was, I think. Maybe not. So question one, what and where are we scaling? So data, good data, local evidence, can help you understand local needs profiles. So where are children most in need of interventions and which types of intervention? Are there gaps in our existing provision? Where should we scale it? Those are the sorts of questions that local data can help us answer. Secondly, implementation. So is it going well? Is it happening in line with fidelity? Data, quant data, maybe can't answer all of those questions, but it can certainly tell us a bit. Is it going to the right families? Is it going to the families that we thought it should be there for? Is uptake and engagement happening? What are the levels there like? And are there signals of promise? And finally, it can help us with the end-bit, the evaluation. Now, this not necessarily the end-bit, should be a continual process, but it can tell us if we arrange our data correctly and analyse it, whether or not it's working, from everything through from kind of before and after studies all the way through to RCTs. Now, I've got some examples, which I'm going to show you, of analysis that we have done in partnership with York, Stockport and Leeds councils. That's a programme that we've run for 3 years called A Fairer Start Local. Much of this analysis we're going to publish in the new year as part of a big report, which will sort of represent the end of that programme. But I'm going to show you some of the analysis now, mainly just as a way of sort of illustrating the point that these are all the sorts of questions we deal with when we're talking about implementation, and data can help us with. So this is a piece of analysis from Leeds, and this is a map by children's centre catchment area, and it just shows us the different levels of need within the city. So the different colours represent the percentage of children not in line with their developmental targets in that particular area. So a dark colour in this context is good, and a light colour is bad. So that tells us broadly that we've got specific geographic areas where some children maybe need additional support. That's a sort of analysis. There's obviously much more complex and different types of analysis on those lines that you could run, but that's a sort of analysis that could inform the type of parenting intervention you want to commission or where you might implement it. Secondly, this is similarly an analysis from York. This time the map is by ward area. This is based on some fantastic data we got from their library service, and it shows us the proportion of books or borrowing rate per 0 to 11-year-old child in each ward. And so in this map, again, dark is sort of broadly good in that sense, in that it represents higher levels of borrowing of books. And you can see here really vast sort of geographic differences across Leeds in terms of how many books are being taken out per child. Now, that could be part of an evidence base which leads you towards commissioning an intervention like Book Trust or something which encourages parent-child reading. If you were to sort of put this together with other bits of analysis, it might take you to a different place. But broadly, it's telling you that there's a need in the population for something which helps children read, in particular wards within Leeds. This is an analysis from Stockport, which we actually worked on in conjunction with Foundations a couple of years ago. And this is a slightly different picture. This is the whole Stockport early years system. So we mapped every single intervention that Stockport have, and we looked at the data based on the outcomes it's targeting, the age range for the child, and then we looked at the sort of usage data. So how many children were going into each intervention. What this shows you, these are just two sort of pictures from that analysis, but on the one hand, you can see the age profile and the outcome profile. And on the right of the picture, you can see this top graph, which is the count of children and the number of interventions each child receives. So by far and away, most children got one intervention, and then as you'd expect, it sort of tapers down to only one child getting 5 or more interventions. And then at the bottom, you can see which interventions were included within that analysis. Now, these are just some of the pictures from the analysis we've done, but hopefully they start to show ways in which your data can paint a picture about what you might need to be commissioning, where there might be gaps in provision and what might help. And then finally, I don't know if this is going to work. It is a video, but broadly it just shows a kind of dashboard that we made for Leeds, which helped us to understand how take-up of the 2-year-old health review was going. We had worked on an intervention there with Leeds where we flipped the default so that parents automatically enrolled into the 2-year-old health review. And we then wanted to understand what that was doing for take-up. So we then took their data, put it into a dashboard. It will work, here we go. So this is the dashboard that we built for them to help understand how the implementation of that intervention was going. That's just one intervention, you could use it for anything, really, but it goes to show that just standard data that all local authorities are collecting can be deployed in this way to show you how your services are reaching families and whether they're doing what you think they should be doing. Now, just before I finish up, perhaps to start the conversation, here are some things which I'll sort of throw out there as ideas for how we might improve our ability to use data to inform the scaling of parenting interventions. The sort of top group is around common data standards. Basically, we all need to agree on what we mean by different terms and how we're going to record those things, because that means it's easier to aggregate data and to do better analyses. So agree the data we need to collect, the standards, and then commit to using them. We need mechanisms for sharing our data between us. So obviously, there's a big information governance point there, but we also need things like APIs. Very important is evidence of use and usefulness. I'm sure a number of you will have encountered poor data quality in your travels somewhere along the line. Usually the number one factor behind poor data quality is that the people inputting the data don't think it's useful to collect it, and so they don't really care, and they therefore collect bad quality data. If you show people that it's useful and that it's being used, you can sometimes correct for that. And then finally, we need ways in which we can scale the sort of front end, the analytical products that you can build to inform these kind of things. So we're hopefully going to be, next year when we talk about the Fair Start Local, giving some examples of that where we're hoping to scale data products that we've created on an emerging platform. But that's another thing that I think helps to encourage the use of data and our ability to do so. That was a little bit over 7 minutes, but that's the end of my talk, and I'll hand back to Donna, who's going to introduce the next session.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Tom and Ben.